There are some questions in the chat, which I'll make sure that we've covered in the discussion that follows. What I thought was I might pose a question to each of the speakers, if I might. Obviously, if other speakers want to give their reflections as well, that's obviously fine, but don't feel that you need to. And then I'll put some questions to the panel more broadly based on what is coming up in the chat. So Liz, if I can start with you. There was a discussion, and you were reminding us of the role of technology and innovation, I suppose, is what we would describe it today in the workplace that typified the work of Robert Owen. And Chris is asking a question specifically about what evidence or record do we have of the reflections and reactions of the workers to the conditions in which they were living. And I guess the reason I think that's a really interesting question is that we are living in an age ourselves, aren't we, of great technological change, which will very, very significantly transform the workplace in ways which are, positive and negative. And it seems to me very, very often that debate is conducted as a sort of macroeconomic debate and not one which engages the experience of workers and whether some aspects of that are positive or negative for them. So just wondered what light you could throw on that.
Well, absolutely. I think one of the difficulties as a historian is taking a balanced view based on the words or the thoughts or reactions of ordinary people who don't get recorded. I mean, I think that's a fair point, because even amongst our various recorded sources, whether they come from our collections or a myriad of other, libraries, archives, the problem is that we tend to get the working class person's opinion in the context of the writer, who's not the person who's saying it. So in the context of somebody trying to make an argument either for or against. So for example, if you're looking at the implementation of new technology in purpose-built factories in say Manchester, the North West and Scotland, and obviously later on in places like South Wales, then you get polar arguments between people who are pro this new technology and people who are against it. And while there are working class voices in that mix, they're outweighed by middle class merchants, industrialists, social reformers. But of course, social reformers who use the selected voices to support their arguments. So we know that even though we do have access to some original opinion, it's coloured very much by the person who's formulating the argument, even in the case of Owen. So I think for reaction to implementation of technology, what we're forced to look at as well is where technology is implemented and how quickly it spreads and which regions it spreads to. So, for example, we know, because of newspaper reports and things like that, that there are in certain places more sustained responses, reactions, riots to the implementation of new technology, particularly where it's a rural context. So you don't tend to see it as much in an established, almost a sort of early urbanising centre like Manchester, but you do absolutely see it in rural communities and hamlets in West Yorkshire. So that's, I think. But there's just not enough evidence available from those people from their own point of view, and very rarely do we find pamphlets and even things like protest banners being secretively kept, or sort of banners for trades unions or that kind of those kinds of organisations, because of course by their very nature they are dangerous things to have. So, in most cases they don't survive, and where they do, they're very rare examples. So I think to compare it to a modern context, I was asked this question by somebody just yesterday about the proposed bringing in, if you like, from Transport for London, of completely automated, card payment systems. So to get rid effectively of the prepaid Oyster card. So the idea of that being, if you get rid of a prepaid Oyster card, you get rid of the people that are needed to put cash payment onto that Oyster card. You get rid of the sort of customer service desk at the tube station. You don't have a person, you just have an app, you just have an automated service. And the obvious benefits for that are there in that things are faster, they're cleaner, they're safer, there's less reliance on cash for the majority of the users who can afford the system. But what that then does do, of course, the flip side of that is for the people who are on, very low incomes, who perhaps still rely on a cash economy, hand-to-mouth existence. It sort of takes those people out of the legal framework for using that transport system. So they'll be forced to, as Owen rightly said himself, forced into a situation where they cannot use that service or they have to do it illegally. They're forced into a situation of crime. And most people do not want to do things that way. Most people want to be law-abiding citizens and want to have agency. So I think that's a perfect example in the modern world of how technology is both a great thing and puts people at a massive disadvantage.
I think that's fascinating, and I think as well, in a sense, that's one of, I suspect that's one of the underexplored dimensions of COVID as well, isn't it? With a move to cashless transactions from a public health perspective. I think that's a dimension which hasn't had the focus it might have there. I guess what you're saying is that, there's a challenge to us, isn't there? That, the idea of kind of voice and participation, which is at the heart of cooperative principles, may not, perhaps for historical reasons, have been given full potential in the time of Owen, but there's a challenge to us to make sure that we deploy those principles properly in today's challenges in the way that you're describing.
Yeah, and I think to give people the background information in order for them to make informed decisions and choices, because of course Owen's whole theory about improving people's future prospects or future citizenry by educating them when they were young. I mean, what education looks like in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and education now, there's very different things. We would study things in a different way, we would ask different questions. But I suppose the very fact that it's a questioning education, because if you don't get given the materials, the evidence, you don't get to debate, you don't get to pick apart a theory, a subject in that way, how can you ever see beyond what you've experienced so far? That's effectively where we need to begin. If we want our future citizens to be able to have the agency that Owen wanted them to be able to have, we need to be, starting when they're really young.
Well, our new curriculum in Wales has that principle at its heart, which is a very neat segue to the question I want to ask Sian, actually, which is, as I said, when you were speaking, Sian, the theme which is occurring in my mind is how do you reintroduce people to this incredible content that you were describing, and you touched to that at the end, and I'm just interested in what you feel is the potential of that body of the exhibition, really, and the digital potential of it, particularly as well, and a question that David has asked for all speakers, really, but I'll focus it on you if I may, Sian, is, what can we do as cooperatives? What can cooperative bodies do together, if you like, working together to make sure that we are, finding the broadest audience possible for the sort of material you were describing in the exhibition?
I think the key is working together. I think, certainly from the creating the exhibition, it's not something that necessarily we would have been able to produce or afford to produce out of our our core resources, our core activities. It's something that we had to rely on funding to provide something which was of a quality, of a standard, to involve the expertise of educational consultants, for example. But I think there is a role as cooperators, of just working together and perhaps taking a longer term view, not necessarily badging it on an anniversary or because that's what we've had to do, or that's what we've done up until now, because that's the way that we've got the funding to be able to do these activities. I think the digital solution does help in some respects, although there is still a cost in terms of staff time, commitment, etc., in producing resources digitally. And also I'm very mindful, working, as I do with adult learners, I'm very aware of the digital divide as well, and we need to make sure that we are not just exclusively providing access digitally, because that can be that isn't necessarily inclusive either. So I think we need to kind of think more broadly around the issues about how we provide access. I think also, coming from a university, even though, the Miners Library, for example, has worked extensively out in the community, university and university collections, I think, are perceived as a little bit no-go by the general public, and perhaps by schools as well. So I think we need to work at how we break down the barriers to ensure that people feel comfortable accessing the archives, the libraries, and the museums that we have. But I think, there's also a role in us working collaboratively with schools and with teachers. And while with the exhibition, I worked with an educational consultant, that was great because she was able to provide the insight and relate it to the curriculum in a way that I couldn't. But the problem was still getting teachers to use the resource in schools, and I think that can only be overcome by working more collaboratively with teachers and understanding how they want to access and how they want to use our resources, rather than us just kind of putting what we think they will like on our websites or in exhibitions. I think that has been a missing link, but it's sometimes I find it, very difficult to start those discussions. And, I'm married to a teacher. You'd think I'd have an inside knowledge, but I don't. Getting into to talk to teachers is quite difficult. And I think, quite often they want things on a plate, which I understand, but are so used to using the same resources time and time again. When something new is created, it's like, oh, I haven't got time to deal with this. Oh, I haven't got time to look at this. And I think, having a more collaborative approach and perhaps a longer term lead into all these discussions and the creation of these resources is what might be needed.
Well, I think there's a challenge there for me, Shan, as well, and for us as a kind of government to try and find ways of supporting schools to develop those channels of engagement really in a sustainable way, because I think the nature of new curriculum is one of constant innovation and adaptation. In a sense, that's one of the key principles in it. So I hope we can find a way of facilitating that. I'm being asked by Chris, I think, to confirm that I think there's a role for cooperative principles in the new curriculum. Just to say before I come to Sarah, the idea of internationalism, of sustainability, of agency, of collaboration, all of those things are both the ways in which the curriculum will develop, but also some of the purposes of the curriculum in a sense. So I think there's a definite set of touch points with the kind of things we're discussing today, which I'm very excited about. Sarah, I wanted to ask you about the question that Chris is asking in the chat. Is an interesting question, I think, given what we've just been talking about. Chris is saying, Owen may have, as it were, imposed his values and visions on a community, and that probably is a different model from the way we would regard cooperative development today. So just the question which has been posed is, in the discussions you've had and in the cooperatives that you've worked with and the communities that you've explored in this way, what has been the balance in your experience of, this is my language now, a sort of an individual vision, if you like, on the one hand, perhaps, versus on the other, a set of individuals coming together on a kind of bottom-up basis to share concerns and possible solutions. What's, in your experience, what has the balance been, if you like?
Yeah, before entering into this endeavor, the Landward trip, of course, I had already participated in many research projects, even in collaboration with a cooperative college there in UK. Was my idea, my conviction before my understanding that a genuine co-op would start from the bottom. That for me was kind of a rule in my mind. But I had to learn that there are actually multiple ways for a co-op to develop, and very context dependent. Of course, there are contexts where there is a group that is already visionary, and perhaps there is an horizontal leadership already prepared to guide then the broader community towards the formation of a cooperative. You might have also context, and I'm referring to Rwanda, where cooperatives were set up right after the genocide, and was not the best context for a proper, genuine co-op, where perhaps they wouldn't have worked together in a different ethnicity. So if I can, in this all different a degree of balance between individual leadership and horizontal leadership, or total engagement, total bottom-up, genuine community endeavor. So in what actually I found as a key factor, and I go back to what we are saying, is education and training. Because even in those cooperatives where it started from outside, the difference then to develop a common vision, because then it's fundamental for a cooperative. We all know if there is not a common vision, it's not a cooperative. So that effort to reach that stage and then to work really collectively and cooperatively was reached through proper education and training. So I do think that this is fundamental. So creating then that enabling environment independently of how this cooperative project starts. That's why also I think it's so important, but you, of course, with the work done in your country, you know better than me, but how is important start with the young people. So to expose them to cooperative values and principles since the very early age, because in this way you're really preparing then this genuine process of setting up genuine cooperatives.
Well, I think that is a good place anyway to bring our discussion to a close. I think you've taken us to the heart of the question there, Sarah. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's certainly a question that's dear to my heart personally as well. So on behalf of all the participants in the discussion more broadly, can I thank our panelists, to Liz and to Sian and to Sarah, for bringing such a rich set of different perspectives to the discussion. I think one of the questions that was being posed in the chat was, how do we share some of these materials? And there's a set of bigger questions about how do we get the balance between our own heritage, our own experience, and the Welsh experience within that, and the vast array of international experience as well. And I think there is, the encouraging thing is that there's a huge amount to draw on in that mix, which is fantastic. So thank you to the three contributors for such an enriching discussion, and thank you for asking me for sharing such an interesting discussion. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn.